This is part 1 of our section on Islam. So in the corner here, you can see this is the Islamic or the Muslim symbol. It is a crescent moon and a star. And I've included the Shahada, which we'll talk about today, which is the main creed of Islam. That is, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. So Islam is the third of the 3 monotheistic religions that we're looking at this semester. It is also the youngest of the major world religions, having been founded in the 6th century by the Prophet Muhammad. So in this lesson, we're going to look at pre-Islamic Arabia, the context in which Islam was born. We're going to talk a lot about the Prophet Muhammad and who he was and what he did, why he's important. We'll talk a little bit about the Quran, which is the Islamic holy text, the scriptures. And then we'll talk a little bit about central teachings and the 5 pillars, which are the 5 main practices of Islam. Okay. So I've included here a surah from the Quran that says, "Say, O people of the book, come to common terms as between us and you, that we worship none but Allah, that we associate no partners with him, that we erect not from ourselves lords and patrons other than Allah." Right. So this quote points out several important parts of Islam, right? The first one being they worship none but Allah, right? It's a strictly monotheistic religion. That nothing is associated with Allah. Nothing is near as powerful or as mighty as God, right? And we'll talk about this, but there's also an implication here when it says that we associate no partners with him. Some people have interpreted that phrase to be referring to Christianity, which, as we've talked about, was monotheistic but believed in a holy trinity, God in 3 persons, which the early Muslims, including Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, had an issue with, right? How can God be in 3 persons and yet be one? Right, it's part of the mystery of Christian divinity. So Islam is very strictly monotheistic, and the other part is this phrase here, "people of the book." Right, that's where this phrase comes from, the religions of the book, which refer to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In college, I actually had a class called Religions of the Book. We looked at these 3 religions. The book being the scriptures that cover the stories of Adam and Eve up through, Moses and all those stories, right? These are shared stories in these 3 religions. And in all 3 religions, they have a set canon, a set text or scripture that is said to be inspired by God directly. So these religions are called the religions of the book. So today we're just going to look at the very early history of Islam. We're going to talk about the life of the Prophet, revelations that the Prophet Muhammad experienced in his lifetime, his pilgrimage or his Hijra from Mecca to Medina, and we're only going to get up to the point in which the written text of the Quran was established. In the next sections, we'll cover the rest of this history up until modern times. So when Muhammad was born in 570 CE, Arabia was in the middle of what Muslims would later call the Age of Ignorance. It was sort of dark ages in Arabic history. Arabia, as you can see right here, this is modern-day Saudi Arabia, but at this time it was divided up between various tribes. Tribes were in constant warfare with each other. There was a good deal of bloodshed. There were no large cities because it was hard to establish large cities when the political and social and economic situation was so unstable. And here you can see, this is where up here, you can see where modern-day Israel is. And here is Mecca. Here it's spelled with 2 K's. Normally we spell with 2 C's, but here's Medina, right? And this is the main settings of our stories about Muhammad. So, as I said, it was a tribal society. There was constant warfare. There was trade, but things had become very materialistic. There were a lot of very, very, very rich people and a lot of very poor people, and not a lot of justice. A great gap between the rich and the poor. It was also polytheistic. It was a very polytheistic society. Christianity had spread and taken over a good deal of the Roman Empire in Greece and northern Africa, but Arabia had a few Christian converts, but not many. So we get the stories of the prophet according to history, according to various literary sources, but especially we get the details of his life from the Hadith, which is a book that combines a number of stories and sayings of the prophet as told by his friends and family after his death. When he died, these stories about him and the things that he said were set down on paper so they wouldn't lose them. And that book is called the Hadith. So that's where we get a lot of the details of his life from. He was born in 570 CE, and he was orphaned by the age of 6, and he had a very difficult early life. He went to live with his grandfather. His grandfather died. He went to live with an uncle. He was a sheep herder for a while. It was not an easy life for him. And he was intelligent. He was good with business. He was good with people, according to the Hadith. But he was not literate for most of his life. He was not literate. But he was very intelligent. In his 20s, he went to work for a widow named Khadija. She was 15 years older than him. She was very intelligent. She was independent. She had a business of her own, and he helped her run her business. And at the age of 25, he married her. Though Islam does allow for more than one wife, and tribal society at that time allowed for more than one wife, the Prophet Muhammad was never had any other wives besides Khadija for the rest of her life. Eventually, she did pass away, and he did take other wives, but he was very loyal to her. So he married Khadija, and life was very good for him. Business was very good. He had a difficult early life, but by his 20s, things were very comfortable for him. And he had a strong interest in religion. And it said that his wife encouraged him in this interest. And he was illiterate. He couldn't read. But he did have contact with a lot of people through his trade and through their business. At that time, there were some Semitic, some Jews in the area. There was some Christianity as well, but mostly polytheistic religion, as I mentioned. And he was somewhat dismayed by all of these traditions. Especially Judaism, Christianity seemed to him to be more right. The idea of one single God seemed to him to be more right than the idea of multiple gods. But still something felt missing for him, right? He used to go out for long walks, and he used to go into the nearby mountains, and he used to sit in one cave in particular, and he would meditate, and he would think about all these different things. In 610, at the age of 40, he was meditating in the cave, and an angel appeared to him. And the angel said to him, recite. Sometimes translated as say or proclaim, but the word literally means to read aloud. To read aloud. So the angel said, read aloud. And actually, this was Angel Gabriel. And the prophet was taken, and Muhammad was taken back. He didn't know what to do. And the angel told him again to recite, to read aloud. And he was very confused because he couldn't read. First of all, he was illiterate, and second of all, he didn't have any text in front of him. So he didn't know what the angel wanted him to read aloud, to recite. And the angel then told him, the angel Gabriel said, Proclaim or recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Proclaim your Lord is the most generous, who teaches by the pen, teaches man what he knew not. And this is the first surah that was revealed to Muhammad of the Quran. Now, in the actual text, it's the 96th surah. A surah means a chapter. It's actually put in the 96th chapter of the Quran, but it was the first one that was revealed to Muhammad. So Muhammad didn't know what to think of this. After the angel said this, the angel disappeared, and he was very distraught, and he didn't know what to do, and he went home and he told his wife, and his wife became his first convert. He didn't know it at the time, but he was starting a new religious tradition, right? But she believed him. She believed that this had happened to him. But he himself was a little bit reluctant to think of himself as a prophet or to try and understand what was happening to him. But over the course of his life, he would have many, many visions like this. And all of these visions and all of these surahs came to make up the whole of the Quran. Which is the scripture, the Muslim scripture. Eventually she encouraged him to tell the rest of their family about what had happened, and his family believed him as well, and they became, his first converts. At the time he was living in Mecca, and was a majority of people there were polytheistic. They believed in the old Arabic gods. After several years, he developed a small group of followers, probably about 40 or 50 followers, not many, but they did strongly believe in Muhammad, in the Prophet, and what he was saying. And they became badly persecuted by the other local people who didn't believe that Muhammad was a prophet. His followers were denied entrance into shops. They were ridiculed. Sometimes they were beaten. And the Prophet really suffered at this time. He suffered from not really knowing what to do, not knowing how to handle this. Well, in 621, which is about 11 years after this had all began, according to the Hadith, according to the stories of the Prophet, he one night had a dream or had a vision in which he was taken up to heaven, right? And he visited the various realms of heaven. He spoke with the other prophets, because Muslims believe in a long line of prophets. He had a chance to meet the other prophets, and he had a chance to have an actual audience with Allah himself. And he is the only prophet. I believe he's the only prophet who ever had that honor. He was the last and the greatest of the prophets. And Allah revealed his truths to Muhammad, that he had revealed that Allah had revealed himself to Abraham and to a good number of other very wise men, and that those who became prophets, and that those prophets tried to teach the message of Allah to God's people, but that, by and by, the people either turned away, or they misunderstood, or they did not fully submit to God's will. In particular, according to the Quran, Jesus of Nazareth was a prophet, not a Messiah, but a prophet, who was a great and very kind prophet. And his disciples misunderstood his authority and began treating him as in a very treated him almost like an idol, almost as though he was unequal with God, which is blasphemy, great blasphemy in Islam. And so eventually the prophet Jesus ended up leaving and ascending into heaven directly, because he was one of the great prophets. And he left the disciples behind, knowing that, they had misunderstood his message. So the Prophet Muhammad had this great vision of being in heaven, and learned all of these things and brought all these lessons back down to his followers. and zeal for him grew. And though his number of followers that he had in Mecca were very small, word of him had spread to several other towns, in particular Yathrib, which is now known as Medina. It was just north of Mecca. And in 622, after many years of being persecuted, the people of Yathrib invited Muhammad to come up to their city and act as kind of a spiritual and also a local leader for them. According to the Hadith, Yathrib, like many other towns in the region, was dealing with a lot of political problems. There had been a lot of warfare. There were a lot of people within the town who had bad blood. There were a lot of conflicts and debates over how to handle issues of law and issues of justice, especially in regards to these ancient blood feuds. And so in 622, the Prophet and his followers made a pilgrimage to Yathrib, which became renamed Medina. It's commonly known now as Medina, which means the city of the Prophet. And he lived there for 8 years. For almost 10 years. And while the Prophet Muhammad was there, he continued receiving visions. He began teaching and preaching more widely, since he had a larger audience in Medina. And he also became a local leader. People came to him for advice. They came to him with disputes, with legal problems, with family problems, all sorts of different things. And according to the Hadith, he was a very intelligent person, very wise. And the kind of person who hears more than what is said and who listens carefully. According to the Hadith, he had deep-set, kind of intense eyes that would look right at you as you were talking. And he made quite an impression on the people who met him. So he thrived in Medina, and his people thrived in Medina. However, there was still a lot of violence in the region. The people of Mecca, he had made a lot of enemies. A lot of people didn't want to see him become a leader, and this led to many battles fought between the Prophet Muhammad's followers and other groups who wanted to destroy this young religion, this young religious cult. So between 622 and 630, there were a series of battles. Out between Medina and Mecca. They went out many times to meet various groups that opposed them. In one particular episode, according to the Hadith, the Prophet had successfully led one battle. They had won a battle, and they were returning into Medina. And the Prophet suddenly stopped. He turned to his soldiers, or he turned to his commanders, and he said, "Now we're returning from the lesser struggle to the greater struggle." And what he meant was this battle they had raged was a lesser struggle, was a minor thing. The great struggle that people face in their lives is that of just their everyday lives, just trying to be good people on an everyday basis, struggling with their own souls to the so-called spiritual battle, right? Not the physical battles are lesser struggles. The spiritual battles are the greater struggles. And the word struggle in Arabic is jihad. And you might know the term jihad. It's thrown around a lot in the news, in the media, as referring to holy war, which isn't exactly true. Jihad means struggle. And Islam does permit its followers to fight or to use violence to protect themselves. If there's no other choice in the matter, the Prophet himself used violence to protect his followers and to protect the early Muslim religion. But But really the greater struggle, and this is what Muslims are taught, the greater struggle is the spiritual struggle. So people who throw that term around, jihad, especially in the news, don't always know what they're talking about. But that's what jihad means. That's where this idea of jihad comes from the Prophet telling his commanders that. So the Hadith has a good number of really wonderful stories, other wonderful stories about the Prophet Muhammad. And one of the most interesting things about Islam is that we know so much about its founder, right? We don't know very much about Jesus. We don't know how Jesus looked. We don't know how Jesus acted with other people. We don't have like little anecdotal stories like we get from the Hadith, you know. Like he one of his wives, Fatima, who was one of his wives, of course, after Khadija died. He married Fatima, and he loved her very much, and she was younger than him. And she tells a story that they used to race by foot. You know, they used to get in these little races. And she would always beat him because she was much younger than him. But then she had a child or two, and she put on some weight. And then after that, she said, you know, he started winning all the races. So we have all these like wonderful little anecdotes about the Prophet Muhammad that we don't have about Moses or Jesus, or you know, or about Shakyamuni Buddha, or a number of other religious figures. So we do know him, right? In 630, he finally prevailed over his enemies. He returned to Mecca, and to this day, all Muslims are obligated to, at some point in their own lives, make a pilgrimage to Mecca themselves. We went to Mecca. He went to the holy temple there, where they held you know, dozens and dozens of idols, and he pulled all the idols out and he turned it into a mosque, or a center for worship of Allah, right? And in 632 he died. We'll talk about the after effects of his death in the next lesson, because it's said that he didn't leave a clear person to take over Islam when he died, and that led to some conflicts of authority, which led to the Muslims splitting into the Shiites and the Sunnis very soon after his death. This is a Persian image of the Prophet riding a horse, and the angels and a prophet looking down on him, right? Looking down on him from heaven. It should be noted that for some Muslims, it's considered very sacrilegious to show images of the Prophet. Shiite Muslims, like Muslims from Iran, are much more comfortable with showing pictures of the Prophet in context of stories, but not having portraits of the Prophet. Portraits are definitely considered borderline idolatry in Islam, and images of Allah are never shown. But we do have from feudal time, from feudal Islam, which is, you know, about up until about 1300 AD. We do have some images of the Prophet Muhammad in the context of stories. And a lot of these pictures come from actual books of the Hadith, and other Islamic writings. So in this image right here, you can see this is an image of the Prophet Muhammad preaching in Medina. You see he's surrounded by people, and he's on fire, right? He's burning with the word of God, the word of Allah. But where his face is, it's just blank. Some people solve the problem of whether or not to make images of the Prophet by doing that, by having like a figure with a blank face to stand for Muhammad. This is one of his, I'm assuming this must be one of his great followers, if he's also on fire, right? If he also has kind of Allah with him. So the role of the Prophet in Islam is very important, right? He was the last of the prophets, and he was the greatest of the prophets. No prophet has come since him, and no prophet ever will. He specifically, he is the prophet, the final prophet in a chain who brought monotheism, right? That's the core of Islam. It's a strict monotheistic religion. While God is the focus and the sole authority within Islam, Muhammad's life story in the form of the Hadith is very important to Muslims as a model of how to live the Quran in their lives, how to live a good life, right? The way Christians look at Jesus as living this kind of perfect life that they can model themselves on. So Muslims think of them, look to the Prophet to model their lives upon. As I mentioned, we know from the Hadith, people commented on his nobility, his humility, and his kindness. And also his general wisdom, right? People came to him with all sorts of problems and things, and he never turned anyone away. The revelations of the Quran speak not of contemplative life of withdrawal, but the need for Muslims to fight oppression and corruption and establish moral order in the world. It's not like in Christianity where you get this tradition of monks and nuns who try to retreat from public life so they can focus on prayer and things like that. You do get a few Sufis and people in Islam who retreat a little bit. For the most part, though, one thing that Islam shares with Judaism is this idea that this monotheistic tradition is part of a greater plan by God, by the Almighty, to create a just society on earth, right? And there's a need in Islam to try and work to make society better and pure. And next week we're going to talk about Islam and politics and the way it influences governments in the Middle East, because for Muslims, the laws put forth in the Quran are kind of perfect laws. They're meant. The purpose of these laws is to help people make a more just society, a more godly society. So for many Muslim countries, the line between state and religion is not always very clear. For some Muslim nations, the religious law is public law. So here's a picture of the Quran here. It was written down in 650 CE, which would have been about 20 years after the Prophet's death. Was finally compiled then. It is comprised of 114 surahs, which are chapters, right? These chapters consist of different stories and commands. It's not like the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, where it's a linear narrative. It's kind of little stories here and there, right? It's kind of a mix of these kind of hymns, which are kind of comparable to psalms. They're surahs of praises, of praising Allah, of praising Allah's goodness, of condemning the evil and the wicked, and interspersed in all these are little stories about the prophets that came before Muhammad and about the world and about humanity, and also. The Quran contains a good number of commands or laws, right? Similar laws that are similar to those of Judaism, Christianity, sorts of things that can be found in the Hebrew Bible. Laws about how to hold your business, how to treat people who are your enemy, how do you treat your neighbors. They even have rules of dietary rules, the way Judaism does. Judaism has kosher, right? The rules of kosher. Islam has its own dietary rules called halal, which are it's actually very similar to kosher. So the Quran contains all the revelations Muhammad received, and these revelations affirm God's unity and also direct life in human society, right? They're two important themes in Islam. The Quran the proper Quran, a proper Quran, is always still in the original ancient Arabic in which it was originally written. You can find copies of the Quran that are in updated modern Arabic that are translated into English or, French or any other language. But those copies are all considered translations. They're not really the Quran, right? They're translations of the Quran. For Muslims, they believe that to alter the words of the Quran, try to, change the language, they could lose some of the important truths to be found in it. And it's a valid concern, right? This happens so often where you translate text scripture from one language to another and things get lost in translation or things get changed in translation. Buddhist scriptures got translated into Chinese using Taoist terms, and from that, they developed a new sect of Buddhism, right? A whole new sect of Buddhism was focused on nature and other kinds of Taoist ideas. I know myself from my graduate work in early Christian studies that to this day there are still great debates and discussions about how to translate various Greek phrases and words from the earliest Gospels into English, right? And how to explain them and things like that. So in Islam, the real Quran, the true Quran, has never been is in the original Arabic as it was dictated to the Prophet by the angel Gabriel. This should be noted, I remember I had a professor in college tell me that ultimately, though, the real Quran, the only true Quran, is in heaven, right? And the ones that we have on earth are just paper copies. So important is the Quran in Islam that it's very common for children to learn the Quran early on, to be taught it, and so the children literally memorize it. Even some children who don't understand, the language, who don't understand Arabic, they're still taught to recite it because it is given directly to the Prophet from heaven, and the words have a lot of power. The words have a lot of power for Muslims. It's said that in places like China, where there are, some Chinese Muslims there, in the West called the Han Muslims, or they're called Hui Muslims. They don't speak Arabic at all, but it's you see old people who will have copies of the Quran in ancient Arabic, and they'll just run their fingers over the words, right? The words themselves have a sort of power, and they give these older people some solace and some comfort in their later years. So the Quran is extremely holy for the Muslim people. And from this idea that the true Quran is in heaven, and that this has all been it was already written before the Prophet Muhammad received it, which is why the angel Gabriel told him to recite it, to read it aloud, because it was already written in heaven. And from this idea, many Muslims have this phrase. They'll say it is written, which is to say it's God's will, it's fate, right? It's something that's written in heaven already. It's something that's predestined. So you might hear Muslims say that, right, about something that happens to them, anything at all. They might say, well, something bad happens to them, and they say, it is written, it's God's will. It's been decided already that things would turn out this way. And again, that comes from this idea of the Quran in heaven. So here is a quote from a modern Muslim teacher. It says, "Today everyone cries for peace, but peace is never achieved, precisely because it is metaphysically absurd to expect a civilization that has forgotten God to possess peace." It's a really lovely quote, and it strikes me as being a quote that could be spoken by a Christian leader or a Jewish leader, right? Or even a Hindu or a Hindu leader. This idea that, but it's especially Muslim, and then it has this idea that in order for there to be peace on earth, in order for there to be a just society, people need to remember God and put God first. Some essential teachings of Islam, some of the basic ones, include the oneness of God and of humanity. All of humanity are brothers and sisters regardless of where they're from. The Shahada is the proclamation that the Muslims make that there is no God but God. It's for the oneness of humanity. We'll have a chance to look at, next week, look at a video of the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca that Muslims take. And it's fascinating because most Muslims who make this pilgrimage will say that they'll get to Mecca and there'll be Muslims from all around the world. There'll be Muslims from Indonesia, from North Africa, from South Africa, from America, from Eastern Europe, from Arabian and Persian, all different kinds of places. And they all speak different languages and they all have different customs. But when they come together here in Mecca, they're all brothers and sisters. They're all one in Islam, right? So oneness is very important. Another central teaching is the prophethood, and how the heritage of, or the tradition of prophets have provided a sort of compass of Islam, the prophets have provided direction for people to follow, so that people know the right way to live. This picture here comes from the story of the night journey that the Prophet Muhammad took. And these are the various prophets standing in line on these steps. Some are closer to God and some are farther, right? Some are higher than others. And this right here is the Prophet Jesus. And beneath him is the Prophet, I'm not sure which prophets these two are, but I know that one is the Prophet Jesus. And you can see he's communicating with one of the archangels here. And these are this is the heavenly host, right? In heaven. Another important part of Islam is that the Quran teaches is this human relationship to the divine, that it is humanity's, or it is human beings' role or duty, moral obligation, dharma, if that's not too blasphemous, to submit to God's will. And actually the word Islam means surrendering, and the word Muslim means one who submits. You remember this? You might remember we talked about Judaism, and we talked about the story of Isaac and Abraham, and that in the Quran's version of the story of Abraham and Isaac, Isaac is told that he needs to be a sacrifice, and he willingly submits to it. He says, if that is God's will, then that is God's will, and we can't fight it, right? He submits to it, and he and his father are rewarded for that submission to God's will. And there is a large part of Islam that is based in faith, right? Faith that God is all-knowing, that God has a plan, that it is written, that God is merciful. And that you have to trust that. You have to submit to that, right? Another important part of Islam, as explained in the Quran, is what the book calls the unseen life, which is kind of the heavenly realms, right? So when the Prophet Muhammad, took his night journey, and through his various other revelations, he got a pretty clear picture of what heaven is like. There are angels who exist to serve Allah in heaven and to bring messages down to people, especially prophets. That there is a Satan. Muslims do believe in Satan and hell, and that these are rebellious angels who did not submit to God's will. And according to the Quran, the origin of Satan is that in the beginning God made the angels and made heaven and earth, and then he made Adam and Eve, and Allah told the angels to bow down before Adam, and one of the angels refused to bow down before Adam and said, no, I'm better than him. and he was cast down into hell, and this is the Muslim equivalent of Satan, right? So he did not submit to God. And they also believe in the Last Judgment, similar to Christianity, that eventually an apocalypse will come, the end of the world will come, and people will be judged according to their deeds, and they will be rewarded or punished. And all of this is in the Quran. The last thing we're going to talk about very briefly is the 5 pillars of Islam. I suppose we could talk about this next week when we talk about practices, but it's an important part to Islam. It's an important part of understanding what Islam is. And so we'll talk about it briefly, and we'll talk about these things a little bit more in more detail next week. But there are five practices that every Muslim needs to follow in order to be a Muslim, right? And this is really interesting because we talked before about orthopraxy and orthodoxy. That some religions are a little bit more orthoprax than orthodox. Christianity is very orthodox. Shinto is more orthoprax. Islam really blurs the line, right? Because it is a very orthodox religion. Like, it is very much based this idea of submitting to God's will and believing in God and testifying to God. And in fact, the first of the 5 practices is to admit to the unity of God and Muhammad's messengership in the form of the Shahada. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is the first thing you must do to become a Muslim. And in fact, if you want to convert to Islam, all you need to do is to pronounce that wholeheartedly in the presence of other Muslims, and that's conversion. That's it. You become a Muslim. So the first of the 5 practices is a statement of belief. And that's how it kind of blurs the lines in an interesting way. The second of the 5 pillars of Islam are the daily prayers, called the Salah. The Muslims have to pray 5 times a day while facing Mecca. This is very much a part of the way their days are scheduled, right? There's a prayer first thing in the morning before breakfast, and then there's a prayer in late morning. There is a midday prayer. There is a prayer probably just before the evening meal. There's a prayer before bedtime. And if you've ever heard on the Muhuddins, who are the people who call the Muslims to worship, and in Muslim cities they have these Muhuddins who chant and sing these songs that in Arabic that tell Muslims, faithful Muslims, that the time has come to pray. And in cities where you have large populations of Muslims, you'll see they'll all stop together when they hear the call to prayer, and they'll all stop whatever they're doing and they'll perform the prayer, and they'll go back to whatever it is they were doing before. It's very common in places like Saudi Arabia and Iraq for people to have prayer carpets on them, to carry these small prayer carpets with them. So in case they're outdoors, in case it's not a dirty place, they can lay out their carpets and perform their prayers there regardless. The third pillar of the 5 pillars is zakat, which is donating a percentage of one's income to charity. Part of being a Muslim is contributing to a just and fair society, and that includes giving alms. And I'm trying to remember which percentage it is. I don't think it's a tithe. I don't think it's 10%. I think it might actually be more than that. The fourth is fasting, which is Saum, and that is performed during the month of Ramadan, which is the holy month in the Islamic calendar. So during the month of Ramadan, people fast, meaning they don't eat, they don't drink water, they don't ingest anything during daylight hours, right? And then when the sun goes down, before it comes up again, they can eat. So for the month of Ramadan, it's a show of Muslims' loyalty, of their submission, of their faithfulness. It is solemn during the day. It can be very difficult, but it also they also have a lot of big parties at night, right, when they can eat. On the very last day of Ramadan, when the sun sets, there's usually a huge feast. Now, keep in mind that while Allah expects all these things from people, Allah is very merciful. He understands if there are things you can't do. Some of these things, like the daily prayers, which require getting down on your knees and standing up and getting down on your knees, or the fasting, or some of these other things, are not required of you if you have a legitimate reason to not be able to do it, right? Allah knows your heart and knows that, if you could do it, you would be doing it. So certain people are exempt from some of these things. Small children are exempt. The elderly who, might have trouble getting around are exempt and might need more sustenance, right, and more food to keep themselves going. Pregnant women who are on their periods, people who are sick or injured are not required to do things, right? You're not expected to do any of this, if it causes you ill or harm. Though you will find some Muslims who do it anyway, right, as a show of sort of their strength and their love of God. And the last of the 5 pillars is the pilgrimage to Mecca, called the Hajj, right? Every Muslim is required to do this, or is obligated to do this once in their lives. It used to be a lot easier, certainly many centuries ago, when most Muslims lived in and around the Middle East. If a great deal of Muslims spend much of their lives saving money up to go on the Hajj. But again, if it is, impossible for you to go because of, physical disabilities, or because you don't have the money, Allah understands that, right? You're not ostracized for not doing things that you can't do, and you're not ostracized by your community. So some of these rules might seem very strict, but remember that there are always exceptions, and ultimately it's about what's in your heart, right? So that is the introduction to Islam, and it's basic, the foundation of it, and the foundational teachings and things, right? In the next section, we'll talk a little bit more about the history and how Islam spread across the world. So discussion question is, what did the early Muslim religions seek to reform, right? Certainly, the Prophet Muhammad had access to Christian teachings, to Jewish teachings. He was in a very particular time and place in the age of ignorance, and he was seeking to return the people to God's way, right? From Islam, from Muhammad's point of view, from the Muslims' point of view, the Prophet Muhammad's teaching was something that had been spread to God's people before, and people turned away from it. So, what was the early Muslim religion? What was the Prophet Muhammad trying to reform and trying to change? Email me with any questions that you have.